global biodiversity. Biodiversity is the short form of biological diversity. It simply means the diversity or variety of plants and animals and other living things in a particular area or a region. Everything that lives in an ecosystem is the part of web of life, including human beings. Each species of vegetation and each creature has a place on the earth and plays a vital role in the circle of life. Plants, animals, insect species interact and depend upon one another for what each offers, such as food, shelter, oxygen, and soil enrichment. Maintaining a wide diversity of species in each ecosystem is necessary to preserve the web of life that sustains all living things. The biodiversity of planet Earth is the total variability of life forms. Currently, around 2 million exact species have been estimated on the Earth. Biodiversity is important for humans through ecosystem service and goods. Biodiversity is the degree of variation of life. This can refer to genetic variation, species variation, or ecosystem variation within an area or in a biome. Terrestrial diversity tends to be highest at low latitudes near to the equator, which seems to be the result of warm climate and high primary productivity. Marine biodiversity tends to be highest along coast in the western Pacific, where sea surface temperature is highest, and in mid-latitudinal band in generally oceans. Biodiversity generally tend to cluster in hotspots and has been increasing through time, but it will be likely to slow in the future. Let me think about the origin of the term biodiversity. The term biological diversity was first used by wildlife scientist and conservationist Raymond F. Dasman in the year 1968 in his book A Different Kind of Country. The term was widely adopted only after more than one decade, when in 1980s it came into a common usage in the science and environment policy. Thomas Lovejoy, in the foreword to the book Conservation Biology, introduced the term to the scientific community. The term contracted to biodiversity may have been coined by W. G. Rosen in 1985. Edward O. Wilson is widely known as the father of biodiversity. Evolution of biodiversity. Biodiversity is the result of 3.5 billion years of evolution. The origin of life has not been definitely established by science. However, some evidence suggests that life may already have been well established only a few hundred million years after the formation of the earth. Until approximately 600 million years ago, all life consisted archaea, bacteria, protozoas, and similar single-celled organisms. The history of biodiversity during Phanerozoic era, that is 540 million years ago, started with the rapid growth during the Cambrian explosion. The fossil record suggests that the last few million years featured the greatest biodiversity in the history. Estimates of present global microscopic species diversity vary from 2 million to 100 million, with a best estimate of somewhere near 9 million. The vast majority arthropods. Diversity appears to increase continually in the absence of natural selection. Let me think about different types of biodiversity. According to Mora and colleagues, the total number of terrestrial species is estimated to be around 9 million, while the number of oceanic species is much lower, estimated at 2 to 2.5 million. It is estimated that there are 2.2 vascular plants, 7 to 10 lakh marine species, 20 to 30 million insects, 5 to 10 million bacteria, 2 to 3 million fungus, 1 million mites. Since the rate of extinction has increased, many extant species may become extinct before they are described. Generally, biodiversity is classified according to 3 fundamental and hierarchically related levels: in terms of genes, in terms of species, and in terms of ecosystems. The first one, genetic diversity. This represents the heritable variation within and between population of organisms. Ultimately, this resides in variations in the sequence of the 4 base pairs which, as components of nucleic acids, constitutes the genetic code. You can see hundreds of types of monkeys and hundreds of types of cows on this earth. And second one, species diversity. The living world is most widely considered in terms of species richness. Biodiversity is very commonly used as a synonym of species diversity, in particular of species richness. You can see n number of species of flora and fauna in a site or a habitat. Discussion of global biodiversity is typically presented in terms of global number of species in different taxonomic groups. Around 2 million species have been described to date. Estimates for the total number of species existing on Earth at present vary from 5 million to nearly 100 million as stated earlier. The third one, ecosystem diversity. Hierarchically, it is the highest level of biodiversity. The quantitative assessment of diversity at the ecosystem, habitat or community level remains very much problematic. There is no unique definition and classification of ecosystems at the global level. It is thus very difficult in practice to assess ecosystem diversity other than on a local or a regional basis. Instead of considering the diversity within and between species, the entire ecosystem is considered for analyzing the biodiversity. Life and life forms of various habitats are different. The flora and fauna of a desertic region will be extremely different from that of a rainforest. Each and every ecosystem or a biome is having its own characteristic assemblage of life forms. Distribution of global biodiversity. Biodiversity is not evenly distributed. Rather, it varies greatly across the globe as well as within the regions. Among other factors, diversity of all living things depends on temperature, precipitation, altitude, soils, geography, and presence of other species. The study of the spatial distribution of organisms, species, and ecosystems is the science of biogeography. The nature and characteristics of global distribution of biodiversity and its spatial analysis forms the focal theme of biogeography. Let me think about biodiversity and its latitudinal gradient. The latitudinal distribution of biodiversity is quite interesting. Generally, there is an increase of biodiversity from the poles to the tropics. Thus, localities in lower latitudes have more species than localities at higher latitudes. This is often referred to as latitudinal gradient in species diversity. Several ecological mechanisms may contribute to the gradient, but the ultimate factor behind many of them is the greater mean temperature and high rainfall at the equatorial region while compared to other regions of the earth. The multiplicity of species of flora and fauna found in equatorial rainforest is to be mentioned here. Biodiversity hotspots. A biodiversity hotspot is a biogeographic region with a significant reservoir of biodiversity that is under the threat from humans. The concept of biodiversity hotspot was originated by Norman Maier in 2 articles in the Environmentalist and another one, the Hotspots. According to Maier, Hotspots are Earth's biologically richest and most endangered terrestrial ecoregions. A biodiversity hotspot is a region with a high level of endemic species that is under threat from humans. The term hotspot was introduced in 1988 by Dr. Sabina Wick. While hotspots are spread all over the world, the majority are forested areas and most are located in the tropics. This point you have to keep in mind. To qualify as a biodiversity hotspot on Mayer 2000 edition of the hotspot map, a region must meet two strict criteria. It must contain at least 0.5% or 1,500 species of vascular plants as endemics, and it has to have lost at least 70% of its primary vegetation. Around the world, 25 areas qualify under this definition, with 9 other possible candidates. These sites support nearly 60% of world's plant, bird, mammals, reptiles and amphibian species, with a very high share of endemic species. Let us have a discussion on the major biodiversity hotspots on the world. Let me consider North and Central America first. Here, California Floristic Province, Caribbean Islands, Madrean pine oak woodlands, Mesoamerica are the major biodiversity hotspots. In South America, Atlantic forest, Cerrado, Chilean winter rainfall Valdivian forest, Magdalena and tropical Andes are the major hotspots. When we go to Europe and Central Asia, the major hotspots are the following: Caucasus, Irano-Anatolian, Mediterranean basin, mountains of Central Asia comes under this category. In Africa, Cape Floristic region, coastal forests of Eastern Africa, Eastern Afro-Montane, Guinean forest of West Africa, Horn of Africa, Madagascar and Indian Ocean islands, Maputaland, Pondoland, Succulent Karo are the hotspot regions. In South Asia, Eastern Himalaya in Nepal, Indo-Burma region, Western Ghats and Sri Lanka are marked as ecologically sensitive hotspots. In Southeast Asia and Asia Pacific, the following regions are identified as hotspots. They are East Melanesian Islands, New Caledonia, New Zealand, Philippines, Polynesia, Micronesia, Southwest Australia, Sundaland and Wallacea. In East Asia, Japan, mountains of Southwest China are considered as hotspots. A variety of objective measures have been created in order to empirically measure biodiversity. Each measure of biodiversity relates to the particular use of the data. For practical conservationists, measurements should include the quantification of values that are commonly shared among locally affected organisms, including human beings. As we all know by now, biodiversity is essentially for maintaining the ecological functions, including stabilizing of water cycle, maintenance and replenishment of soil fertility, pollination and cross-fertilization of crops and other vegetation, protection against soil erosion and stability of food production and other ecosystems. Conservation of biological diversity leads to conservation of essential ecological diversity to preserve the continuity of food chains. Threats to biodiversity. A number of threats affecting biodiversity today. The most authoritative classification in use today is IUCN's classification of direct threats, which has been adopted by major international conservation organizations, US Nature Conservancy, the World Wildlife Fund, Conservation International, and BirdLife International. The major threats of global biodiversity are discussed in the following part. The first one is habitat destruction. Habitat destruction has played a key role in extinctions, especially related to tropical forest destruction. Factors contributing to habitat loss are overpopulation, deforestation, pollution, global warming, or climatic change. Another factor is that introduced and invasive species. Barriers such as large rivers, seas, oceans, mountains, and deserts encourage diversity by enabling independent evolution on either side of the barrier via the process of allopatric speciation. The term invasive species is applied to species that breach the natural barriers that could normally keep them constrained. Without barriers, such species occupy a new territory, often supplementing the native species by occupying their richness or by using resources that would normally sustain native species. The number of species invasions has been on the rise at least since the beginning of the 1900s. Species are increasingly being moved by humans, and the invaders are causing drastic changes and damage to their new habitats. Extirpation, population decline, and homogenization of regional biodiversity are much more common. Next point we have to mention here is that genetic pollution. Endemic species can be threatened with extinction through the process of genetic pollution, that is uncontrolled hybridization, integration of genetic swamping. Genetic pollution leads to homogenization or replacement of local genomes as a result of either a numerical or fitness advantage of a introduced species. Hybridization and introgression are side effects of introduction and invasion. Another threat is overexploitation. Overexploitation occurs when a resource is consumed at an unsustainable rate. This occurs on land in the form of overhunting, excessive logging, poor soil conservation in agriculture, and illegal wildlife trade. Joel Watson, Director of Wildlife Conservation Society Asian Programs, called the latter the single largest threat to biodiversity in Asia. The international trade of endangered species is second in size only to drug trafficking. Another threat is hybridization. In agriculture and animal husbandry, the Green Revolution popularized the use of conventional hybridization to increase yield. Often, hybridized breeds originated in developed countries and were further hybridized with local variations in the developing world to create high yield strains resistant to local climate and local diseases. Local governments and industry have been pushing hybridization. Formerly, huge gene pools of various wildlife and indigenous breeds have collapsed, causing widespread genetic erosion and genetic pollution. This has resulted in loss of genetic biodiversity and biodiversity as a whole. Climatic change is also another threat. Global warming is also considered to be the major potential threat to global biodiversity in the future. For example, coral reefs, which are biodiversity hotspots, they will be lost in 20 to 40 years if global warming continues at the present trend. Human overpopulation. From 1950 to 2000, world population increased from 2.5 billion to 7 billion and is forecast to reach a plateau of more than 9 million during the 21st century. The massive growth in the human population through the 20th century has had more impact on biodiversity than any other single factor. At least until the middle of 21st century, worldwide loss of pristine biodiversity depend on the population growth itself. Conservation of biodiversity. As we all know by now, biodiversity is essential for maintaining the ecological functions, including stabilizing the water cycle, maintaining and replenishment of soil fertility, pollination and cross-fertilization of crops and other vegetation, protection against soil erosion, and stability of food-producing and other ecosystems. Conservation of biological diversity leads to conservation of essential ecological diversity to preserve the continuity of food chains. Biodiversity provides the base for the livelihoods, cultures and economies for several hundred millions of people. It includes farmers, fishermen, forest dwellers and artisans. The rapid erosion of biodiversity in the last few decades has impacted on the health of the land, water bodies and people. Biodiversity is the wealth to which no value can be put. In the final analysis, it is very clear that survival of the human race is dependent on conservation of biodiversity. It is evident that this invaluable heritage is being destroyed at an alarming rate due to the several reasons. Measures are being taken up at national and international levels to address this issue. The Earth Summit produced a plan of action on the number of issues. You might have heard about Agenda 21. It includes the conservation of biodiversity during the 21st century. There are several strategies which are adopted for conservation of biodiversity. Some of them are discussed. The first one is legislation. The formal policies and programs for conservation and sustainable utilization of biodiversity resources dates back to several decades. The concept of environmental protection is enshrined in the Indian Constitution in the Article 48A and 51A. Major central acts relevant to biodiversity include Environmental Protect Act 1986, Fisheries Act 1897, Forest Act 1927, Forest Conservation Act 1980, Wildlife Protection Act 1972 and Wildlife Protection Amendment Act 1991. The various central acts are supported by a number of state laws and statutory forest laws in other natural resources. Next one is in situ conservation. Conserving the animals and plants in their actual natural habitats is known as in situ conservation. The established natural habitats are national parks and sanctuaries, biosphere reserves, natural reserves, reserved and protected forest, preservation plots, etc. National parks are highly protected by law. No human habitation, private land holding or traditional human activity such as firewood collection or grazing is allowed within the park. Sanctuaries are also protected, but certain types of activities are permitted within these areas. Biosphere reserves are another category of protected areas. Under this, a large area is declared as a biosphere reserve where wildlife is protected, but local communities are allowed to continue to live and pursue traditional activities within the reserve. Another conservation policy is ex situ conservation. Ex situ conservation of plants or animals preserve or protect them away from their natural habitat. This could be in zoological parks and botanical gardens or through forestry institutions and agricultural research centers. A lot of effort is underway to collect and preserve the genetic material of crops, animals, birds and fish species. Another policy is recording indigenous knowledge. The lives of local communities are closely interwoven with their environment and are dependent upon their immediate resources for meeting their needs. These communities have a vast knowledge about local flora and fauna, which is very important for biodiversity conservation. Next one is community participation in biodiversity conservation. It is being recognized that no legal provision can be effective unless local communities are involved in planning, management and monitoring of conservation programs. International conservation strategies. Conserving biodiversity is not an issue confined to any one country or a region or a community. It is a crucial global concern. Several international treaties and agreements are in place in the attempt to strengthen international participation and commitment towards conserving biodiversity. Some of them are mentioned here. The Convention on Biological Diversity. This was signed during the Earth Summit in 1992. It focused not only on conserving biodiversity but also an unsustainable. It focused on not only conserving biodiversity but also on sustainable use of biological resources and equitable sharing of benefits arising from its use. Another one is the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species of Wildlife Flora and Fauna, CITES. This is an international treaty which is designed to protect wild plants and animals affected by international trade. The Convention on Wetlands of International Importance. This convention is also known as the Ramsar Convention. It was signed in Ramsan, Iran in 1971 and came into force in December 1975. It provides a framework for international cooperation for the conservation of wetland habitats which have been designated to the list of wetlands of international importance. These attempts aims at conserving the biological diversity and their genetic integrity. Plants, animals and microorganisms in their totality should be treated as the part of the natural ecosystem. It is to be remembered that man is also a part of that system. In that sense, biological diversity should be considered at any cost.